what these programs are actually producing and what they're likely to produce by doing a historical analysis of the other loan programs and what they did, right? So, please.
I think I'm going to push back just a little bit, and I guess it's because I think natural capital has the potential to put some of the things that we care about on more equal footing with the sort of, I'm not going to use the right words, but with the capitalist, sort of the way that we think about a capitalist system, right? So I'm thinking about things like the potential for, you know, a landscape to produce clean water that we have absolutely no ability to put in the same terms if we don't talk in terms of natural capital. We can talk about how pretty it is, we can talk about its intrinsic value, but we don't have something that puts it on an equal footing with the sort of cement plant that I want to build there, right? And so, I mean, I think it has a potential upside, which is let's put that clean water on equal terms, in the same language as that cement plant. And then we get to say, oh, I kind of wanted to drink that water. Now, you know, that's obviously embedded in a structure, but that structure exists. And so, I mean, I find it sort of more compelling to think about what it does given the structure we have than what it could do. Although I was trying to think about your example of oil on my feet and trying to decide if the fact that I figured out you could burn it was like, I think it does imply inequality. That's what I came to on the oil example. That implies inequality. And you know, if I'm the one who figures out you can burn it, probably I'm out in front, and probably I get something from you when you figure out that I'm cooking my food all of a sudden, and you're like, ooh, it's a lot easier to chew or whatever, right? So I think it does probably imply inequality at some level. But I'm not sure that you're worse off because I figured out how to burn it. And so I didn't know this sort of history of Locke and Reynolds. But it's a nice example to kind of just think about from that perspective. Although I still keep coming back to like trying to think about the world we live in. What does it mean in that world? No, John, no, don't call on John next.
Could I just mention, in terms of natural capital or an ecosystem services assessment, the sheer usefulness of these as a concept. This is the week when a judge is trying to assign penalties to British Petroleum for the Deepwater Horizon blowout. Well, without being able to think in terms of what is the value of the service provided by the ocean in this case, the judge couldn't levy that fine. So we might think of this as a moment in which we use concepts of monetized nature as a very useful, tool, right? It's a way of controlling BP's appropriation of the resource that had been freely available to all. So I'm thinking about this concept of the commons as well, and how while we're talking about appropriation and exploitation, we can also be thinking about using concepts from natural capital as a stick, maybe to control the appropriation that multinational corporations engage in.
So I guess I would just submit, thinking about the historical record as much as the theory of it. I have to say, Richard, I'm really, compelled by your analysis, and I think it's a very powerful one. But I guess what I'd say is that, intrinsic value of nature sort of fetishizes it in a way that doesn't seem to have much better results to me than the commodification of it, right? And you could go down a variety of ways of thinking about this and thinking about all these different possibilities as a way of thinking about, what nature is, what its sort of value, or whatever other word you want to use, a placeholder there, serves to different people in different contexts. I guess what I think about this is that maybe it's not the idea of natural capital that's such a problem, but the way in which it's deployed. And I think that the history of ideas shows us that ideas are very slippery things and no one owns them. They get deployed and redeployed and adopted, and they themselves get commodified in different ways. And so I think one way to follow this and to think it is what are ways in which this idea, let's just say for a moment that we weren't going to reject it. What is one way, or some ways in which this idea might be usefully mobilized for I'm tripping on words here, a more just future, right? Whatever that means to the people for whom it affects. And so, while I sympathize with this, I guess I'll just say that I wonder if the problem is the natural capital itself or merely the regime that's adopted it.
May I respond?
Please, absolutely.
Okay. Well, the first thing I would say is that, of course, I didn't use the term intrinsic value. What I propose, for the first time here, is a concept of natural capital formation on the same a sort of conceptual plane as, for example, the concept of racial formation. If you hear somebody talking about natural capital, then you immediately should start thinking about what political project they're trying to accomplish by using that term and that phrase. And you're not going to be able to get outside of that analysis, I don't think. It's going to be coming from some perspective. That's all I said. And it's a struggle between those perspectives. What is natural capital going to be? Well, that's an emergent outcome of compromise between opposing forces, and that question is not closed. So I do think that we need to protect these environments, and certainly we need to motivate corporations to stop polluting the air with carbon. And how are we going to do that? Now, if you don't mind, I would say that there is, in fact, a really long tradition in the United States of voluntary association, which has established decades of experience.
Voluntary
associations, yes, right. Providing decades of moral discourse on the public sphere and public trust values. And they've done so much to present. In fact, if you ever visited Redwood Forest, it will be because people from inside of that discourse came in there and stood for something other than the marketplace. They said, and they don't even care. They may not have their concept all straightened out, but they will change themselves here and prevent until finally the collective sentiment can shift politically and start providing the legislation that it needs to protect these resources. A lot of places in the global south aren't even close to the level of environmental destruction that we visited on the Redwood Forest and on US soil in general. Because, well, for example, everyone's focused on the tropical forests because they exist. The Redwood Forest was 96% cut before people started dying to save the last 1% that was still possible to cut. 3% were preserved in parks. The rest of it is now a monoculture industrial tree farm, period. It's not an ancient redwood forest anymore. Right? And down there, they have those forests.
I understand that struggle. On the other hand, a lot of the redwood forests we have remaining in California were set aside by racist oligarchs and robber barons 100 years ago. And so, I don't value those places any less for the things they provide. And yet, Madison Grant's eugenics does not particularly appeal to me as a rationale for protecting redwood forests. And so that's what I mean by the fact that ideas are slippery and history is complicated in that way.
Good point.
So I feel like we've been talking about this. I feel that we have been talking already about whether there are alternative or complementary frameworks that we can imagine growing or fostering around the idea of natural capital. And I brought with me today my 1997 or 1998 reissue of Schumacher's Small is Beautiful, right? This is not a text that people are reading today, but it is a book that imagines that there could be a choice for a different scale of capitalism, right? Schumacher is the one who popularizes this notion of village technologies, intermediate technologies. His phrase is enoughness. Right, that there could be a kind of choice to stop growing. Right? There could be a natural capital that doesn't imagine that it has to maximize dividends, right? I gather that we might begin to imagine making use of natural capital as a tool somewhat in the way that Shoemaker did, right? So what kind of mobilization that would require, Sarah, I'm not sure, but is there a way to communicate these values to groups of people sufficiently to stop the juggernaut that Richard is describing rolling out. So.
Yeah.
Just a suggestion for a paradigm shift here. Perhaps we should think of natural capital as a tool to be used to combat the excesses of the corporatization of our society. Basically, what we have done over the past 40 years at an accelerating rate as we have given increased power to corporate interests. They're not values. They're interests. The interest is growth of profits. That's the corporate interest. And that has so overwhelmed human values that are responsible for the way that we have organized our society, that we need powerful tools to combat that juggernaut, as you say. And in a sense, natural capital, for example, thinking of oil and gas reserves as a natural trust fund that we are liquidating and calling income for purposes of satisfying the desires of corporations for increasing growth is, it's a total misrepresentation of what's going on. And in my sense, when we need to fight those corporate interests continuing to take an ever larger share of the benefits provided by nature, and doing it by excluding the externalities from their prices, from putting onto unsuspecting populations the consequences of their appetites. That we need powerful tools, and I think that is a tool that could be used productively in fighting those tendencies. So just an idea.
I would just say that the natural capital ideal, the idea of it, is their tool, actually. It's their tool. It's the corporation's tool themselves. I propose that we're debating this right now because of all the money they're putting into it. It's their initiative, right? Not because everybody read Shoemaker, which I actually read in the early 80s, and which had a profound influence on me, actually, as a lot of that counterculture discourse does, and I think is beginning to again now as people start to realize, especially, for example, the Occupy movement, which is essentially now President Obama's analysis, right? The 1% analysis, it's correct, and it pervades all these different domains, and yes.
John, before you, can I call somebody?
Sure, yeah, let's open
There's
it.
a student back there that has had her hand up. Tammy, did you want to say something? Because I know you've worked on this stuff. No? All right.
She said she'd go after, right?
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Well, what a panel, and you got a lot out of the topic I thought might make me sleepy, which it didn't at all. So,
Can't hear you.
I said, I'm just congratulating the panel on the quality of this discussion. And I started to raise my hand when Sarah started to make a defense of the use of natural capital as an argument to protect a valley, to protect a water supply. Because unfortunately, I think, well, that's practical. It means agreeing to play a game that's already been rigged. So I think that's why precisely we shouldn't reify or take as natural the way things are at present. Because the problem isn't natural capital, it's capital. And my reaction to the term knee-jerk was because it was applied to one side. I think you might as well use the term ideology for knee-jerk. Because we're talking about a clash of ideologies and a clash of actual social forces. That's what we're living through today. And the stakes right now are very, very high indeed. it's not an exaggeration to say we're talking about the future of humanity itself. I think those are the stakes, and if we allow business as usual to proceed, not just unchecked, but in fact, it should be dismantled thoroughly in some way to ensure that we have a future. And it's another way of saying, with Richard, who is Truth in Advertising, my research collaborator for the past 4 years, a little more eloquent than I, that this is precisely what the climate justice movement that we study is trying to figure out, hasn't figured out, but is trying to figure out. And I think with the humanities here, that the words we use are important, that they're powerful, that discourse is powerful, that system change, not climate change, the brilliant slogan that came out of the fiasco in Copenhagen is a very powerful meme. Just as Naomi Klein's title, This Changes Everything, is a very powerful title. And I think that we need new, creative, powerful stories that move us to rise to this occasion. That's my speech.
So I get to follow that. Thank you. I just had an observation, or it seemed to me in listening to all of you that we're assuming that this natural capital metaphor, concept, approach, framework, tool, it seems that we're just thinking in terms of money. And for me, I think this approach, and Sarah, you had mentioned this a bit, is the fact that we can now put other things on the table, not necessarily in monetary terms, but things like pollination or other things that we usually take for granted, and get them into the discussion on, hey, yeah, people do value these things too, and anything we do is obviously going to have some consequences and impacts, and so how can we better make more informed decisions on what to do in terms of those interactions between all of these things that we value. So I liked hearing that it is a tool, and I think definitely in working where those decisions play out and all the structures and politics and power relations, I think it can be a very useful tool and an approach. So I just would challenge all of us to kind of think more proactively on how we can use those things to what you're talking about, Peter, of making more of a just world that we're striving for. Thank you.
I'm wondering if you could all talk about sort of the rhetorical ability of natural capital as a figure versus a discourse that rejects the discourse of value in capitalist terms, which is its own discourse of apocalypse. In other words, what's more effective if we assume that the goals are the same? What exhausts itself less? What are the stakes in the language? Just, you could all say something about that, because, yeah.
I would love to hear your remarks on this from the standpoint of events or anything like that. But I would say for sure that the idea, the concept, the moniker, right, natural capital, it like I said previously, it's like a moonshot, right? Let's go for the whole thing, right? That it's such a powerful meme, as you said, or metaphor, right? Natural capital. I mean, it's what critical theorists have been trying to say for so long from the opposite perspective. In capitalism, it's just being naturalized. It's a historical formation. Now, they're seizing the discourse. And by the way, John, one of the big things to come out of the Lima talks is the fact that system change is now the UN discourse of the carbon credits and everything. It's all about systemic transformation now. We've got to change the whole system. This is system change. It's a co-optation en masse of the, have you seen this stat? Okay.
Well,
it's
but wait, if I
definitely
may,
the
just
case.
for a minute, but what I'm suggesting is that you're addressing the illusory quality of that metaphor. I'm suggesting
Okay.
something else. It seems to be really gaining traction. There seems to be a power to it, and you want to say, well, it's an illusion. But assuming that people are working in the same direction for the same goals, is it? I mean, why is there something more appealing about it? I would even say, I would risk saying, more appealing than the discourse of apocalypse in talking about the future of the planet.
Well,
I
we
have
can say
a-
the word managerial,
Yeah.
right? We
Okay,
can
so-
introduce a term like, the concept of being able to manage.
Agency?
Sorry.
No.
Yeah, so, yeah, other panelists or?
I mean, I think the way I think about language, because I think about politics, is that it's always used strategically, right? And so it's always used sort of when it's effective and when the person saying it thinks it's going to be effective, right? And so then I was trying to think about whether that means you're playing their game. And I mean, my sense is that folks who are using the language are using it because they think that it will get them what they want, given the rules of the game, sort of. And so, in that sense, that's why I think it's appealing, right? Just because it seems like it's got some traction and making progress. And then that's not to say there aren't 100 other ways to say it, right? And I think they're all going on too, right? I mean, we're talking about natural capital, but there are all sorts of moral arguments going on, right? There are all sorts of apocalyptic arguments. I think, one of the reasons this is appealing is because it's not as scary.
Yep.
And it gives you some sense there's something to do about it, right? Which is the big problem with climate change, is that if you talk about it as this awful thing that we can't do anything to fix, then we can't do anything to fix it, so why are we talking about it, right? And it's really demobilizing language. And so this seems like sort of mobilizing language, and that's why I think it gets used.
I would add that it's also very profitable.
Let Richard talk first. I'm going to go first to that. Let Richard talk first.
Kim, do you have other comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think that's on the market. Use term managerial. I mean, it really is a paradigm shift, right? So for so long, this is why I used the knee-jerk thing, John. We've had this idea of ecology and self-correcting systems, and we've sort of intervened, and now it's a problem. The solution is to pull back. But this managerial, this forward-thinking, this jumping into it, and to think of something in the big picture like climate engineering and all this, there's a decade or two people would have laughed and scoffed at this whole thing. But to do that, I mean, it seems a huge paradigm shift. And from, to Susan's question, from a narrative, from an ideological point of view, to be able to sum that up in a way that doesn't, get a knee-jerk response again, I think is really great. I mean, because it is a huge shift. I mean, it's just not the way we've been used to thinking, but it absolutely, positively seems essential that we do.
Yeah, I wanted to say I really like Sarah's analogy of the tool, and thinking along Richard's lines of the farmer in Zimbabwe and in the valley, and bringing it closer to home to Iowa, and thinking, okay, we have this tool, natural capital, and it's really who wields the tool. The tool can be wielded by that farmer, as well as by the corporation who wants to expropriate, or by the government who wants to take over those resources. And we say there's a farmer who owns land and is growing corn, and it turns out there's oil, or frackable oil under that ground, or that there's a pipeline that could efficiently run across that farmer's ground, or a wind turbine that could be planted on that farmer's ground. And the farmer says, no, this is my natural capital, I keep it, you can't expropriate it. I have the mineral rights, I have the atmospheric rights, I have the wind rights. That's the end. If that farmer can hang on to that tool of natural capital, it's good. If the government can say, oh no, it's our wind, or it's public domain, and we can expropriate it, or if there's a corporation that says, well, we'll frack on your neighbor's land and basically take away your atmosphere. So I think the tool is a good thing, and it really depends on whether the farmer, whether it's more a common good wieldable tool, or whether it's a corporate, we have to maximize the profit extractable from that plot of land, what's underneath it, what's above it, that it's tricky. I think it could be a positive tool in that sense. So if you have comments on that.
Comments or?
No comment?
So I'll comment. I mean, the notion of a tool is really great. The difficulty with all this, though, I mean, to work it out and specifically, I mean, in terms of something going back to Locke and before, you know, rights of property, who owns this, who controls it? I mean, there was a great study that came out, I think it was in Science 2 or 3 weeks ago, about the, you know, if we're going to limit, you know, atmospheric temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius, what do we have to leave in the ground as far as the amount of fossil fuels, and what do you have to start with off, right? And it's really great, but the issue is, you know, how do you identify those reserves in individual countries and work out how that's going to happen? You know, I mean, if you think globally, it's great. You can think of, you know, well, this much coal, this much, you know, natural gas, this much oil, but how does that actually work? I mean, that's where it becomes an incredibly complicated question. But as Richard, how do you do that? You know, because I mean, because it's not it's multinational.
It's going to be a big fight. I mean, you're talking about devaluing a giant component. I mean, they talk about the carbon bubble, right? If you leave that oil in the soil, as the movement is asking to do, you're talking about destroying the wealth of generations, which are, you know, reliant on those capitalized assets, right? It's all stock. It's like they discover the oil, they own the stock market goes up based on the future value, right? Take that out of the marketplace and you're going to be destroying livelihoods en masse. So that's a difficult tool to use, I think, right? But it will be used, and please.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, everybody. This was an incredibly stimulating panel, and I learned a lot, far out of my own disciplines, okay? So I had a question for Richard. You promised us at the end, I thought you were promising us an upside, and you made a comparison, I thought, between natural financial capital roadmap and the global environmental governance that the UN, or I wasn't sure where this is coming from, but I wondered what that was. What is, and is it positive or not?
There's a little bit of irony in that, and I kind of like the struggle. It's my object that I'm fascinated with. Excuse me?
Microphone, please.
Yeah. I meant in the sense that when you see forces of this incredible magnitude unleashed on the world stage, which is what I'm witnessing, I sort of feel inscribed in this present discourse the possibility of the struggle and the imminence of the struggle that's going to take place for this century. And I'm sort of looking forward to it. It's going to be big. It's going to be hard. And people are going to, you know, nations will rise and fall, that sort of thing. And we have to face that. And so it's kind of like pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, right? Okay. Let's see what happens.
Where do you want
That's
to
what I meant.
Zach?
I would ask or challenge the panelists to think about the role of expert knowledge. Because when you're dealing with this question of natural capital, to take up E's example of trying to put a value on the judgment against BP, right? What are they going to have? What are the reparations going to have to be? The natural capital model would be, okay, we're going to ask a panel of management ecologists, right? Well, how do we value the services that the ocean provides there? How can we reduce these much larger liquid, semiotic, affective flows that the ocean mobilizes into the framework amenable, that can be accounted for, right, in economic terms. So there's an obvious reduction that has to happen. And it can only happen by asking experts to weigh in and do that reductive work. But, of course, why does the discipline of management ecology exist at all? Why do we have these experts to turn to? Because that discipline is founded on this, this notion of natural capital to begin with, whether it's called that or not. Right? So to think about a kind of system that's already been rigged, that's the kind of cycle we're stuck in. So I would challenge you to think, well, how can we get out of that? And maybe one answer is for us is to think not only in a kind of Marxian analysis, but we have to kind of move to a kind of Foucauldian analysis to actually think about the role that knowledge plays in this economy of ideas. I would suggest, as a way to think also about alternatives or the lack of alternatives in the ideational space, is what if instead of asking a panel of management ecologists to reduce the value of the ocean to a kind of set of an economic number, what if we just put it to a vote for the citizens of the United States and Mexico? What would you like BP to pay? What is the value of the ocean to us, right? And I think the very unthinkability of that as a rational response speaks volumes to how much we are already within the system of natural capital, right? We can't think outside of that.
In fact, the discussion about the value, the fine that BP is going to pay, it's a question of statutory interpretation. I mean, there is a value per gallon that is listed as the cost, maximum fine, right? So it's already been abstracted to that level. Nobody's really talking about what the value of the loss was. It's strictly a matter of statutory interpretation at this point.
Does anybody remember the Santa Barbara oil spill?
Oh.
And how about esteemed economics professor of UCSB, Dr. Mead? Any friends of Dr. Mead here? He valued the birds killed in the oil spill at $1 each. So that the value of they call him buckabird after that when I was talking, when I was here as an undergraduate. And anyway, I just want to say that that notion of technocracy is the horizon of this discussion. I really believe that's the most profound question, right? You can barely even understand these contracts if you start studying what these these green bonds are. It's like trying to understand a reverse mortgage option that's traded by Goldman Sachs. And once it gets beyond that level of discourse, it's very difficult to stay focused. Right? It's so complicated that they don't even know what they're doing. So Shoemaker would have said the technocracy, right? Remember that concept of the technocracy? And Herbert Marcuse, by the way.
So I think that one thing you learn when you study the history of science is, that expertise is incredibly important, has a lot of potential power to it, but knowledge itself is not power, right? Knowledge needs to be mobilized in certain political contexts in order to become power, right? And so then the question is, how do you mobilize expert knowledge? And I don't think it's necessarily a fait accompli that only certain institutions can do that. As a matter of fact, over the last many decades in the United States, and partly because of state changes in the law that occurred between about 1964 and 80-something, let's say, the distribution of political power over a lot of environmental decisions has changed dramatically, right? Has changed dramatically. And that has to do with the relationship between expert knowledge and the statutes, right? And so there are, I'm not saying that that has fixed the problems we face. What I'm saying is that expert knowledge is by no means attached or wedded to any particular discourse or set of institutions. Rather, the question is what are the levers of power, right, in the society, in the broader society, and how can expertise be mobilized for this question of justice that we keep coming back to, right? And I don't think that's by any means set in stone. And maybe there is a little bit of a silver lining there in that question. And this room is, frankly, filled with experts or budding experts. So take it upon yourselves.
I want to echo some statements that have been made here. I'm a little uncomfortable with calling capital a metaphor. I think especially in the humanities, conceptual precision is decisive, because otherwise, as usual, we are dismissed as humanists because it's all wishy-washy and so on. So there is a conceptual precision to the concept of capital. And that means capital is inseparable of private property and accumulation. And by the way, the concept of capital was never limited to dollar figures, because capital is accumulated human labor in all its aspects. So, along these lines, I would suggest, since we have here so many humanists, why would be, resource, for example, is not capital? I mean, a resource can be capital, but it's not synonymous. So, my question basically to, everybody here is, in order to think about alternatives, why wouldn't we put to work our creative minds and come up with alternative concepts?
I had kind of the same question, and more largely, like, you know, I want to almost take almost a view more largely like what is eco-criticism, what is ecological thinking doing at this point, that we need to suddenly kind of go to this other frame. You know, I wonder, defining alternative modes of valuation is something that revolutionary politics has wanted to do for a very, very long time, right? And it's something that now, is there a kind of a movement, more largely we're seeing an abandonment of kind of revolutionary environmental politics and thinking more that we need to like a compromise along the way. So I mean, it's like I share your concern that it seems like the second we say, okay, let's accept this framework, the framework's going to do the work the frameworks always do, you know, so.
I mean, a couple of times people have raised the question of the commons, right, or the national trust. I think the concept of the commons is one that eco-critics and political activists are using to try to revivify this notion of the commons and to bring it back into play and to try to mobilize some enthusiasm around it or some investment in it, to use another loaded term in this context. So are there other examples of, again, to come back, alternatives or sort of other kinds of tools, refinements, nuances, control mechanisms that people can think about that we might allude to at this point, seeking that silver lining?
Well, one thing, just keying off the notion of the public trust, and I think Richard mentioned this as well. The reason the public trust doctrine is ancient, right? But the reason we have a real state responsibility for the public trust, with respect to things like water and coastlines and fisheries, in the state, in part, in its contemporary form, in part, is because a group of students and faculty from UC Davis and UC Santa Barbara, beginning in the 70s, started doing work at Mono Lake in the Eastern Sierra to figure out what were the values of that lake. And they developed the science around it, they brought it to court, and they won a Supreme Court case against the LA Department of Water and Power, right? And so this is, this may seem like ancient history to some of you, but the fact of the matter is that that was a major precedent in terms of the state's obligation and major agencies in the state's obligations to living up to its ancient public trust responsibilities for maintaining some resources for the people, right? And so I think that that's an example of the way in which expertise and budding expertise can be sort of mobilized for these kinds of causes.
Can I add a little bit to that?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And Elizabeth, thank you for a very precise question. I think the answer to which is inscribed in the question itself, and that is the common. I think that is the message that it is possible, and we have this long tradition of community and voluntary association, which has always relied on this concept. And sadly, what it tends to accumulate is discourse, whereas the other discourse accumulates as property for more power over labor and more accumulation. It's a self-reinforcing system in this set of society where property law is what it is. Okay, but the discourse of the common, I think, from a cultural studies perspective, the book to look at is Negri and Hart's third book by the title. Help me out, somebody. The Common. I think it's called The Common, right? The Common. It's called Commonwealth. The title is Commonwealth. And I think people got sick of Empire and Multitude, and they were too long, but they're brilliant books. The best one of the trilogy, which nobody talks about because they're burnt out with something, is Commonwealth. And it holds up this idea of the common as the answer to your question. And so if I wanted to really provide an answer, I would read that first and then send you an email or something. Because I wish you had the answer to that right now. It'd be great. Just unveil it.
Did everyone respond as wanted to this question? Okay. So a piece that I felt, or that's been calling to me throughout this conversation has been
power and who holds it right now and grappling with that concretely. So it sounds like we feel like because we're talking about this, we have some power over it. Because we're talking about, you know, do we want to engage with this metaphor, natural capital, or not? I mean, what effect do debates like that have over, for instance, the way that wages and labor have been valued? It's, you know, they're not going to experts to decide wages, and they're certainly not putting wages to a vote, right? Wages are determined in an entirely different way, partially through the market and mostly through force, right? Force on both sides. Some force from below through nonviolent direct action and violent direct action, through strikes and sit-ins and resistance, and then through the force of, you know, removing people from their sources of strength, their land, their houses. It's strange to me to think that we can mobilize something like a metaphor and use that to contest power without holding power. And so I'm kind of wondering throughout this whole thing, if we're going to use this tool in the toolbox, or any tool, any alternative mode of valuation, which I agree, alternatives besides capital would be great. But if we're going to use these tools, like how do we get to the point where we have the power to determine those things? Right now, we don't have the power to determine decent wages, especially not for people around the world. We don't have the power to determine the proper valuation of wages, the proper valuation of our time, of things like childcare and care work, with the proper valuation of anything. Because capitalism, by definition, is not us having the power to decide, right? It's capitalists having the power to decide. Capitalism is an undemocratic system. I think what we're proposing by talking about whether or not we have power over this tool at all is a system where we have a say in the definition, we have a say in the valuation, which to me doesn't sound like capitalism. So my question then is, how do you plan to employ power to approach the kind of the situation where we can actually enact the values you're talking about, where we can actually use valuation, whatever we want to call it? I think it's window dressing what we call it, but where we have a say in determining valuation in a just way. How do we mobilize power to get there?
Well, that would be another panel.
Chris has it.
Okay. Responding to this, Chris, or?
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe add to what Zach was saying. I mean, Zach said it beautifully, and thank you again all for a wonderful panel. I'm really glad the question of value is being brought up, and not to put any of the panelists on the spot, but a couple of you were slightly dismissive about the notion of like intrinsic value, which I can understand why in practical terms, because it's been ineffective, and it's also brought the same problems of power, of race, of gender, that capital itself. You know, so like say aesthetic value. You again have to ask, like, okay, who's doing valuation? But so on the one hand, I can understand how this is a seductive concept within the system because, for instance, it could really change the field of like environmental, legislation, of environmental litigation. It can make everyone in the U.S. a potential plaintiff, whereas now environmental standing is very difficult to acquire. And yet, going on with Zach's question, and perhaps broadening out just a little bit, the whole notion of ecosystem services seems to indicate an anthropocentric view. I mean, we're saying it's services for us. And so, I would just ask, like, is there a way we could, like, maybe flip the concept and, in Zach's terms perhaps, show that this is actually like funneling a view of nature that is totally constructed by, not just the people in power, but like humans in general, and how can we recapture like ecosystem services for the ecosystem, for instance. So thank you very much.
I don't think that's gone. I mean, we talk about polar bears all the time with respect to climate change, and to me that's just sort of a clear example of an intrinsic value. I really have no instrumental value for a polar bear. I never see them, right? And they're super powerful in the conversation. And so I mean, my sense is it's not gone, and I guess I'm also sort of a Pollyanna, but I think we live in a pretty pluralistic society in that sense. Like there are just a huge number of different arguments going on, and I don't know that I subscribe to the idea that we have no power. I don't know who we you know, I mean, there are big environmental organizations that are mobilizing around polar bears. Like, that seems to me to be exactly an example of what you're talking about. It's totally mobilizing around intrinsic value. They're not, what's that?
They're losing. We're losing. You know, polar bears.
This is not decided, to my mind. I mean, the climate change conversation is not decided, I don't think. I could be totally wrong, and I don't think any, you know, none of us know for sure. We won't.
The polar bears are going ashore and training with grizzly bears. So the polar bears are adapting.
What's that?
The polar bears are adapting and going back to shore.
They're gonna get brown. But I mean, I think so. I think it's out there actually, like more than maybe this conversation raised, because we were talking about natural capital, and I think it is actually really, like, for some people that is what's mobilizing and what motivates them to engage. And actually, you know, not to get too researchy, but the research is that different people turn out to be motivated by different ideas, right? And that, like, some people would find the idea of natural capital in the private part of it, right? The individualist part of it to be not at all motivating. And then other people find that really motivating. And some people find the idea of polar bears totally, or the commons, for example, totally not interesting to them, and therefore not motivating, right? So they just don't get excited, and then they don't do anything, right? And so that's the sort of pluralist part of me that thinks, like, we just live in such a world of plurality of all kinds, and then we see arguments because of that, I think, right? Responding to that strategically.
Well, I have to close this formal version, this formal phase of the conversation, and just say that I learned so much. I'm so grateful. I want to thank all of our panelists for their time, and I want to thank the audience members for their engagement. I'm very excited about this conversation. I hope we have a lot more panels like this. I think I appreciate Susan Derwin's help getting this one going, and I want to also mention that there is wine and cheese, I believe, right through those doors. So if you want to talk more, please stay and
thank you to ECO.